submission from the Migration Observatory, which I think the clerk is kindly circulating now, which hopefully may reflect on the interests of your subcommittee. So.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. And we will, I think, Michael, that's acceptable as written evidence, isn't it? Even though it's not appeared within the time limits. And that's extremely helpful. And that you don't want to say any more at this stage, is that right?
Probably not at this stage. It's probably that. Please feel free to come back.
Okay. Hugo.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Hugo Brady. I'm a senior research fellow at the Centre for European Reform, which is an independent think tank on the European Union based here in Britain. Our line is to be pro-European but not uncritical, which means we broadly think the EU is a good thing but also acknowledge its flaws and that it could work much better. On the specific area in question, the global approach, which was introduced under the UK's presidency in 2005, I'll just give you my very general opinion on the subject, which is that it's a time when countries worldwide are there's almost a desperate need for a global infrastructure for migration to manage migratory flows. But that desperate need is measured or is equalled by the lack of really serious political will to agree on concrete initiatives that could make something like that happen. I know the committee has heard evidence from Sweden's migration minister Tobias Billström, who sometimes talks about the need for a GATS agreement on migration, but we're many years away from that. And I think the global approach to migration does reflect that, because it is a very good concept, but in many ways, as we'll no doubt hear through the course of the discussion, there's a poverty of ambition on many of its specific elements. I'd be happy to get into what I think, how it could work a little bit better in the course of the questioning.
Right, thank you. Well, we took evidence, of course, from Peter Sutherland. He was our first witness, and he talked to us a bit about his work as the UN Secretary General Special Representative for Migration, and also about the work of I now forget the name of the organisation that he is involved with. Global Forum for Migration, that's right, which I think has a meeting coming along towards the end of this year, and on which he told us some quite interesting things, including the not altogether surprising, but alas all too normal pushing and shoving about whether the Commission, the European Union or something like that should be represented at this forum. So we've had some evidence on that area, and that's very helpful that what you said, and we will, I think, now move into questions. The first question I'd like to ask you is, what, if any, achievements do you think the global approach has made in its first 5 years? What do you think the priorities for the global approach should be in the period ahead? Do you think that the correct balance has been struck between the 4 different thematic priorities set out in the Commission's most recent communication, which were irregular migration, asylum, legal migration, and development?
Well, my sense about the global approach is that it's basically about an attitude change, and also a sort of rallying call for the various elements of the EU's infrastructure, the Commission, the Member States, the various bodies that are charged with negotiating things like readmission agreements with third countries, the drives for visa facilitation, the enlargement talks, development aid. There is a natural desire to get all of those things under the one roof in a bid to finally have some sort of coherent approach to migration issues. Now, it's a journey rather than a destination. Of course, it's not really possible to take a global approach in any area of government policy. That's sort of a utopian fantasy in its own way. But at least a bit like the Global Forum on Migration and Development, the Global Forum on Migration and Development doesn't really discuss development. It's a way of allowing member states to sit in a room and talk about migration, which sounds like something that is so completely simplistic it's hard to believe, but this is actually true. The topic is so sensitive, it's very difficult to establish effective fora to exchange views, useful data, and we haven't even got there yet, but agree some sort of proper initiatives that would resemble some sort of governance on this very difficult topic. I mean, the global approach itself is basically just an agreement to try and, as far as possible, join up all the various bits of the EU's thinking and action on the area, because the EU itself is a major actor in migration policy. And why is that? Because of free movement, because of the fact that, you know, between the 27 member states, you can move around without the need for work or residence permits. And after a while, if you're a third country national, which make up 2/3 of all the foreigners in the EU, you can also gain this right. So there's a natural need there to take a more coherent approach, but it's never really been achieved by any government or any forum to date. So we must view the EU's efforts in the area through that lens. Also, the global approach as an idea has been around for a very long time, notwithstanding Britain's adoption of it. There is a rumour that in fact it used to be called the comprehensive approach to migration, and due to a translation error suddenly became the global approach to migration. So we don't know how true that is. But certainly the British tried to relaunch this concept, get it onto the agenda. Not long afterwards came what we call mobility partnerships, which were an effort to gather up all the different bilateral discussions countries were having with EU countries were having with countries of interest from the point of view of migratory pressure, and package these up into something that was actually more attractive to the third country in question, and would also hold out some possibility of deeper cooperation with them on things like the repatriation of illegal immigrants, on improving their approach to document security, which is a sort of a major bugbear in particular for the British government, in terms of spending development money in a more targeted way. For example, what British officials will often say to you is that the earlier you intervene in the decision to migrate, the cheaper it is for both the migrant and the government. This is basically the most efficient use of taxpayers' money on this issue. And that means preventing the need to migrate in the first place in most cases. So I'm afraid, apart from that very sort of windy, idealistic view of how we could join up all migration policy, the global approach hasn't really achieved very much more than the acceptance that there is the need for that, then a lot of meetings, dialogues, exchanges of views with other countries. For example, the global approach has, you could say, two tiers of cooperation. One is the mobility partnerships, which I just sort of described, which the EU has with Cape Verde, Moldova and Georgia, and is in discussions with Armenia, Tunisia, and eventually is hoped Morocco. The mobility partnerships, although I've written about this slightly differently in some of my publications, don't actually involve a straight trade-off for visas for greater cooperation on migration and greater dialogue. They sort of involve more, it's more the last point, which is a greater, more comprehensive dialogue, where they have so-called migration missions, where the teams will go from Brussels to these capitals and compile what they call migration profiles, which is that the country in question often doesn't have a clue about the actual migratory movements out of that country. But the EU countries cannot hope to manage migratory movements without actually having that information. So a big part of the initiative is to get those countries to compile the data and trends in such a way that it would be usable by European officials or exchangeable with European officials. So they've achieved that partially through the mobility partnerships, and also through a lighter form of mobility partnerships, the so-called common agenda for migration and mobility, which, if any of you are familiar with NATO, is sort of a partnership for peace and migration. So that's what's happened so far, and I have to say that the whole process did seem to peter out a little bit around the time of when member states were slightly distracted by the change in the EU's rule book following the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty. It's now coming back on the agenda, especially since the Arab Spring, and a rather panicked reaction from the EU's institutions to show that they were highly active in the migratory area. I don't know if any of you remember, the Commission was basically forced into producing a long paper on migration, which showed all the different things that the EU was doing in the area, including its discussions with North African countries. However, I mean, some flaws are very evident in the process. Number one, the global approach is rather a Jesuitical thing. I mean, it's very difficult to say what exactly it is, apart from a number of dialogues and some agreements. It hasn't really delivered a huge amount in terms of concrete results yet. That it may do, but especially given the very low level of ambition for global discussions on this matter, it's certainly worthwhile for Europe to try and take a lead. Secondly, I think a big thing that weakens its possible effectiveness is the lack of any joined-up approach with the development sector. And you see this right across the development community. It's actually the development community is a vested interest in and of itself. Even in other areas of foreign policy, the development community including in the EU in terms of the External Action Service, isn't really interested in joining up what it does with the priorities of, say, interior ministries trying to manage migration better, or foreign offices trying to gain a greater leverage over countries to do work on things like the rule of law and so on. So the development community hasn't really played ball, and that includes on a global level with the Global Forum on Migration and Development. The second issue is that the approach needs to be joined up a bit better in terms of the EU's missions abroad. I wrote another piece last year in which I said eventually the EU will need a sort of European migration organisation to help manage things like resettlement programmes, things like the very sort of joined up approach that we're trying to discuss, which dealing with governments on the ground. A lot of what the mobility partnerships do, for example, is done in the capital or in the country in question. So it would make a lot of sense that the EU's missions abroad develop a very strong identity in terms of the officials there who can work on migration issues. And they could probably do with the same immigration liaison officers that national embassies do, for example. I think that there needs to be a greater, and this would also be the view of the British government, it won't surprise you. At the moment, the Commission is very willing to do things like mobility partnerships with basically any interested partner. However, it seems that I think that after an initial trial run of 5 years or 7 years of the global approach, they now need to decide what exactly are the countries we need to be targeting and what do we need to be doing with them. In my view, for example, we should certainly be working with Turkey or have some form of mobility partnership, or if you want to call it a free movement partnership because Turkey is a candidate country, as opposed to, say, it's very nice to have a mobility partnership with Moldova, but countries like Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on are greater priorities for the EU than these small test-run countries that have so far been tried out. Also, the mobility partnerships themselves, I'm not 100% sure how useful they are because they haven't been evaluated yet. We're discussing today about the evaluation of the global approach, but the global approach's main concrete sort of initiatives are these mobility partnerships, but we don't know how well they've worked individually and what they've produced in terms of concrete results and what they've delivered back to the Member States.
The Commission doesn't produce an annual report or anything like that, does it? On the mobility partnerships?
Not on mobility partnerships.
Because they do on many things.
Yes.
And so they have not actually reported to the Member States and the Council anything on the existing, is it 4 mobility partnerships that exist?
3.
3.
2.
I'm not sure.
Anyway,
It's three
you're not aware of them having produced anything?
No.
No. Well, we'll have to follow that up when we go to Brussels, which we'll be doing in early November, to talk to the Commissioner and to talk to the EEAS as well about the external side. Professor Key.
I'd agree with, I think, most of that. There are 2 or 3 things I maybe want to add. I think the first of these relates in a slightly abstract form as to how we consider the relationship between institutional design and changes on the ground. And I think if one looks historically at flows of migration, we know that if we look back over the last 40 years, which may or may not be a good guide to what happens in the next 40 years, that countries that were once source countries of migration become destination countries of migration. The patterns and flows of migration change fairly significantly over quite short periods of time that actually may be quicker than the period of time it takes to create new institutional forms. So just to give a couple of examples, I'd support the importance of Turkey and the changing dynamics of Turkey. If you look at what's happening in cities like Istanbul right now, places that were sources of migrant flows out of Turkey are now neighbourhoods which are sometimes welcoming, sometimes just receiving new migrants from across other parts of the world, not least from the former Soviet Union. So the migration dynamics do change very, very rapidly. And so we need to look, and that there is some work that's been done in Oxford about the kind of changing networks of migration that highlights the propensity for these networks to change far more rapidly, I think, than the evidence so far of patterns of institutional design within examples such as this. I would pick up, secondly, the point on the Arab Spring, though, that I think one of the things that is illustrative about this, and I think I'll get the figures wrong but broadly right, hopefully for the in terms of recording, but I think of about 750,000 people that moved as a result of the Libyan conflict, for example. Only about 30,000 of them came to the EU. So the profile of an issue like the Arab Spring and the public reaction to it means that I personally think that a structure such as this is important to at least address public concerns, because what we know in terms of, and I know these are questions that come up later on the agenda, but what we are absolutely clear about is that if governments as a whole are seen to be lacking in a facility to address public concerns, then those concerns will amplify. And so I think that the necessity of having a framework for coordination is almost self-evident. A third point, though, that I would pick up, and again this is maybe bordering on the questions that come later, is that I do think it's also worth returning to some fairly basic points to start out, that when we're thinking about migration controls, we know that very straightforwardly there are three simple areas which we are addressing, which are the numbers of people that come in and go out, the skills and selection process by which we allow people to come in and go out, and the rights that are extended to migrants. Now, we know that the logics of those are extremely different across the EU nation states. So I know we're coming to this later on, but I think any debate about the competence of European-wide frameworks has to start from the very clear position that depending on the nature of welfare states in different nation states, depending on the nature of labour markets in different nation states, and depending on where different nation states are within the economic cycles, then the logics of migration are very different. And so any overarching framework has to take into account that any optimal policy design must recognise those major differences that are absolutely at the heart of migration flow.
Yes, that's very interesting. It's a point that's certainly, I think, been borne in on the committee as we've taken evidence, because we had, for example, the Swedish Minister for Migration, whose attitude to this was completely different to some of our other witnesses. And so that underlines the point you're making, really. And the whole issue, therefore, of that rather slippery concept known as subsidiarity arises in this area quite clearly. Thank you. Well, second, Lord Avebury.
Yes. First of all, to ask what do you think the EU needs to do to improve its engagement with third countries on migration issues, bearing in mind that what you said so far indicates that, first of all, partnerships to return unwanted migrants to countries of origin by themselves are not working, and that the mobility partnerships come up against the problem that the EU has no competence over visa awards. So I can't see how this provides us with a roadmap to go forward if we're relying solely on the mobility partnerships to regulate immigration.
Well, I, as with the whole global approach, I do think that the attitude it's wisest to adopt to the mobility partnerships is that it's better to light a candle than to curse the dark, because the EU member states are simply never going to make the sort of powers available to the EU to allow it to set labour quotas or to they're highly unlikely in the current environment to adopt a more generous attitude on visas. It's very difficult to see how we can turn the mobility partnerships into any stronger form of instrument. But what I do think they need to do is now to see if the concept works properly, because after all, if it doesn't work, there's no real point in trying to conclude a mobility partnership with everyone we can just to say the EU is doing something on migration. That's the same attitude that we had with the readmission agreements early in the last decade, where the EU was given the Commission was given a list of agreements of countries that where the other member states wanted an overall EU approach on the return of illegal immigrants. We need to basically see if the mobility partnership. First of all, we need to evaluate the mobility partnerships, and I do think that the couple of years of operation they've had is enough to step back and say, does this actually work as a concept? And second of all, we need to see whether or not the actual readmission agreements themselves are worth investing so much time and energy in. For example, the readmission agreement, an EU readmission agreement doesn't prevent you having your own readmission agreement with the country in question, provided the arrangements don't clash with each other. Which is more effective? Is the bilateral approach more effective? Is the overall EU approach more effective? One big added value of the EU overall EU approach was that readmission agreements were supposed to EU readmission agreements were supposed to you would return not only the country's nationals but also any national that had travelled through the country's territory to get to your country, and this was thought as enormously attractive. But a subsequent evaluation of the working of the readmission agreement so far shows that actually this is a rarely used clause in such agreements. Now I for one don't exactly know why. Perhaps it's just too complex or not politically possible to enforce these terms, but that's another question we have. How useful are these instruments anyway? I absolutely agree with Michael that the framework is worth having, but we do need to test whether or not the actual approaches we're using have worked. I certainly think, as I alluded in my sort of opening remarks, that some possible steps forward are stronger engagement in the mobility partnerships by the EU's missions abroad, an actual attempt to join up policy with the development world, so that's DG DevCo and DG Home in Brussels parlance, prioritisation of the countries in question. Commission officials were very, very proud a few years ago when India expressed some interest in a mobility partnership. But when the talks actually got down to it, India, and even in the face of such a weak form of cooperation, said perhaps this is a bit too advanced for us. We should just have a common agenda or just discussion on migration for the moment. So, as Michael also alluded to, you have to take into account that other countries, contrary to what we feel, are not desperate for comprehensive agreement with the EU on migration, especially if they can't really see what's in it for them. And also their own state of development is going to be, it's hard enough for quite sophisticated Western European countries, without being patronising, it's hard enough for those countries to have a conversation between themselves on migration. So we also have to temper our expectations with what we can do with countries at a very different level of development. Having said all that, I do think that after a sort of pre-teen stage, it's time for the mobility partnerships to get serious, and it's time to try and actually come up with a list of priority countries just the same way we did with readmission, and say, okay, European Commission, go out and get us the agreements we need with these countries, and then that will be something worth evaluating.
So maybe the Indian model is one that we should be pursuing, that instead of having mobility partnerships, we should have forums in which we discuss migration as part of a wider agenda with, you say, with India, but it could be with many other countries that would be far more flexible than mobility partnerships, particularly bearing in mind Professor Keith's remark that migration dynamics, he said, change rapidly. We saw that in the case of Libya, because although you said that 750,000 people migrated from Libya during the uprising there, and 30% of them came to the European Union.
They're just 30,000. 30,000. So that's probably
30,000.
Probably more like 8%. 8-9%.
But that figure has fallen rapidly. I mean, we had hardly any migrants from Libya in the first quarter of 2012.
That's exactly right.
So that if we had had a mobility partnership with Libya, the circumstances would have changed so drastically that we would have needed to renegotiate it in the light of those changes that have actually taken place. So isn't the mobility partnership concept too inflexible to take account of major changes in the environment, such as the Arab Spring?
Well, you could argue it's not an either or. I mean, that some countries might be more suitably handled through a looser form of cooperation, whereas others might be more usefully handled through a more intense form. You don't have to say that one is better than the other for everyone.
I think that's right, and also I think that the nature of the flows of people is sometimes unpredictable. So if you went back a few years, if you take the Indian example, one of the things that's quite interesting that structures part of the migration debate right now is the issue of intra-company transfer. So where you have major corporates like the Tatas or others who have IT expertise, who will locate in the United Kingdom some of their workers for a period of time and have a flow of people coming into the UK for a period of time. Now that period of time may be less than 12 months, and so they may not officially count as a migrant in some cases, but how you then talk about the ways in which the relationship between the burgeoning strengthening of the Indian IT sector and the outsourcing of information technology in the United Kingdom works involves the movement of people from India to the United Kingdom for periods of time, sometimes being counted as migrants, sometimes not being counted as migrants. It generates a set of issues, but it doesn't lend itself to the sorts of institutional framework that we would have thought about 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, let alone 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. So I think that's another example of the ways in which processes are changing on the ground faster than our ability to design structures sometimes. But I don't think, a way to reiterate, I don't think that's necessarily a counsel of despair.
But in the case of the professional, highly skilled migrants that are needed by multinational companies like Tata, isn't it far better to leave this to individual member states? Because we have Tata as a major investor in the United Kingdom, and we're probably unique in that respect, and they don't have similar large plants in other European countries. So that to attempt to have a European framework dealing with highly skilled professional migrants would be counter to the to what we actually see on the ground, which is that the investment of these companies differs widely between one country and another.
I think I'd come back to the chairman's comment in a way. I don't think there's necessarily an either or in that sense. I think as I began by saying, I think the variegated nature of the political economies of the different nation states of the EU is so profound in terms of its relationship to migration that there has to be a very strong element of subsidiarity to begin with. At the same time, I think there are a number of dilemmas where issues of harmonisation can potentially be quite productive. So I don't think harmonisation has to apply across the board, and we may come on later in the questions to talk about things like how labour market tests work. And I think the work of the Migration Advisory Committee in the United Kingdom has actually been quite helpful in advancing thinking about how we might prioritise some areas of migration, and that may offer practice that can be helpfully harmonised across the union. So I think there is, because we need to start from an understanding of the profound differences of the needs of different national economies and accommodating those needs. I think that does not logically mean that there are no areas at all in which that there is not either a need for a framework or a need for some areas of harmonisation.
Well, don't you think, finally, that because we concentrate so heavily on workers, we tend to ignore the much more important, to me, question of how we deal with family reunion. And isn't that an area in which we should be looking for greater European harmonisation, since it would be illogical, for example, to admit spouses readily to one European country and not to another, especially considering that in the end they're going to be able to move between the various European countries.
My personal opinion about that was I think you're absolutely right. So the issues of family unification will become more and more important over the next couple of decades. Whether or not the harmonisation works at the level of the European Union or within frameworks of human rights which may transcend the European Union boundaries, I think is a moot point in that sense, because what one is talking about is the rights of people to be united with members of their extended family. So I think there is an issue which may not be the subject of today's discussion, but which I think is quite profound over the next decade.
Well, I think let's move on. But I'm sure Lord Avebury will forgive me for telling you that this committee took the view, contrary to what he said, that the British government ought to have opted in to the draft directive on intra-company transfers, and the government decided not to. But let's leave that for the moment. Lord Mackenzie.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I think we accept, gentlemen, that the question of immigration is a fairly hot political issue in any democracy, fed not least by a popular media. Given that, and of course because of ageing and skills shortages in Europe, how do we reconcile the demand for immigrants against the background of popular opposition?
Sure. I think obviously this is an extremely important question, but again it's worth coming back to the basic premise of the question, which is where the popular opposition comes from. And I think, again, it may be telling members of this committee a truism that is well known by all, but I think it is important to reiterate that whilst the economic benefits of migration accrue at one geographical scale, the geographical scale of the labour market, the welfare externalities, the costs of migration, tend to accrue at different geographical scales. So there is, just in the nature, the way in which migration works, a mismatch, a geographical mismatch between the costs and the benefits of migration. So even where it's possible to prove, and there's a wide literature on this, that there are economic benefits of flows of migration, that the people that are on the receiving end, which comes back to some of the populist opposition, are frequently in areas subject to rapid neighbourhood change, and areas in which the impacts of migration are not necessarily squarely matched with the benefits. So I think that's just part of the process of migration. So how one then handles that? I spent a couple of years on a commission that was set up by the government in 2005 after the 7th of July bombings, the Commission on Integration and Cohesion, where we spent quite a lot of time trying to address precisely this issue. And I think there was a strong commitment to thinking about issues of institutional transparency, about how you thought about how the impacts of migration were realised on the ground, how those were addressed in terms of both bringing together old indigenous communities with new arrivals, and a set of policy prescriptions which were about making visible the challenges of migration, which I could spend much greater time going into. But the point I'd make at the outset of the debate is that what is absolutely needed, and I think this is where we come back to the start, is a sense of recognition of how the dynamics of migration work, that there are benefits but there are also costs, a sense of institutional transparency about recognising that if you have things like housing queues, pressures on health service, pressures on school places, then there is an ability to make visible the challenges of migration on the ground. It was very striking in the work that was done by the Commission on Integration and Cohesion, quite how variable the situation was within the United Kingdom itself. And this comes back, and I think we may come back to this again, to the issue of subsidiarity below the nation state, as well as between the nation state and Europe. But if you look at the United Kingdom, the areas of opposition to migration and the areas of mistrust around migration are not straightforwardly predictable, either from the places where there has been most migration, or frankly from the places where the pressures of migration have been greatest, or where one might objectively expect there to be opposition. What I think I would, again taking this from our Commission's work, would say is where one found the greatest opposition to migration and new arrivals in that period of time from 2006 to 2010 were places where a lot of the local authority related networks were least effective in mediating the impacts of migration. So where you actually had on the ground organisations that were well coordinated, well organised, working with community organisations, with private sector employers, trying to address what the challenges of migration were, that then it was quite possible to have very difficult circumstances, but relatively low opposition to migration.
I raised this with the previous witness, Charles Clark, the former Home Secretary, and he minimised, I suppose, is the right word, the reality of the pressures on housing and health services and so on, certainly from his experience. Has there been no sort of evidence-based research on or cost-effective analysis of the benefits of immigration in terms of economic prospects and so on, and compared to the real economic effects of the pressure on housing and health? It seems to be people are just sort of using their own gut instinct, if you like.
I mean, there was actually a very good House of Lords inquiry on the economic benefits of migration a few years ago, but there is quite a lot of work on migration impacts. And of course, I mean, to simplify a large literature, I think what a lot of things depend on is the length of time over which you measure the impacts, because obviously there are impacts in the short term, but also as you proceed through generations, you can measure the benefits either by the new population as in total or in terms of the old population.
It's a changing scenario.
So you have changing, absolutely. Yeah. But I think, you know, at a more prosaic level, that if you look at the inner London boroughs, if you look at the census data that came out last week, which show pretty significant population rises in places like Newham and Tower Hamlets, where many of the boroughs in the inner ring of London are adding classrooms on a regular basis, and where some schools have very intense concentrations of migrant pupils. There are very clearly demonstrable welfare externalities to the migration process, and I think addressing those has to be at the heart of a sensible policy around public opposition. The final thing I would say, sorry for giving Hugo a chance to, the Migration Observatory, which is a project based in our centre, COMPAS, did some work around opposition to migration. And one of the things that came out of that was that whilst in the United Kingdom opposition to migration is more intense than pretty much anywhere else in the European Union, depending on the questions you ask, you get some very different answers. So if you ask across, just give one example, across professions, whether or not we should be allowing more fully qualified doctors into the country, predictably you get a very different kind of answer to if you're asking whether we should be admitting unskilled labour into the country. So the variations in opposition are actually quite profound by sectors as well as by geographical region, and if it's helpful, I can let you have copies of that research.
I think it would be very helpful if we could do that. It would inform our work. I mean, I think what I deduce from what you've been saying in your very interesting reply to that question is that there are whole sort of structural paradoxes piled on top of each other, and that's what makes it so very difficult to handle. Hugo.
Well, I'll just add a very brief addendum to that comprehensive reply, which is that just to look at the big picture. I mean, global migration and global mobility is increasing, and it will change our societies probably as much, or relatively as much, as other big shifts in history, such as in the Industrial Revolution and the move from the country into the cities, etc., etc. And of course, in that you will get both an amazing benefits. It will unleash and channel and focus human energies in ways that we can't even conceive of today, 20 years from now. But also it will discombobulate many people in the process, which always happens with great historical shifts. On a more micro level, anti-immigration sentiment tends to be counter-cyclical, which means the big inflows happen, people realise and feel its effects. Their political opposition to further migration is registered. The government attempts to close the borders or control migration. Migration does go down a little bit, usually also more for economic reasons, the fact that there aren't as many jobs in the country in question. The public is satiated to some degree. The processes in the natural automatic stabilisers that spring up, building classrooms, the communities becoming used to their new identities, assert themselves, and there's some more slack in the system for further migration in the future. That is just to say that we have been here before many times, and immigration policy is a reasonably elastic instrument. So it's every time we have a panic over immigration, it feels like the first time, but there are many panics, and they do eventually pass and move on to the next level. And what the challenge for policy is how to manage the process, which is why all we can do with migration is manage it, because there's no way of turning it on and off.
And can we rationalise it at the European level? Or is it an investment decision? Is there anything the EU can do to assist in reconciling it?
I think that what the EU's job needs to be is making sure that where it is useful, where migration between European countries is useful, as few barriers as possible should exist. I know it's a very interesting point you raise, because if you sort of talk to some people in the European Commission, I suspect that they would very much love to create an EU-wide point system such as the UK has, for example. But to my view, that would have a high likelihood of becoming a bureaucratic nightmare. I know that you've heard evidence from Tobias Billström where he's very proud of the Swedish system of pushing most of the decisions towards employers and allowing it to be an employer-led process. So it would depend on, if there was an EU-wide approach, it would depend on which approach was taken. And I have to say, although the people in the European Commission are broadly excellent on this topic, I do think that if given an opportunity to regulate the whole thing, that they would find it difficult to resist. And of course we're already regulating various seasonal workers, intra-corporate transferees, etc., etc. But I do, when I hear any of them use on the bigger picture, it's this sort of stuff that comes out. And I don't think an EU, given the teething problems we've had in the UK system, I think an EU-wide point system for the single market would be a horrendous outcome. So
thank you, Roger. I think that if the Commission officials may find it difficult to resist, I don't think the Member States will have the same difficulty. Right, Lord Judd.
I find this fascinating. Taking what the Chair said about piles of paradoxes and what you've just said to my colleague, if you had a clean sheet of paper, but you had the insight and experience that you have at your disposal, would you suggest that the money, the time, the effort should strategically go into building an EU policy? Or would you say that the time, the effort should go into concentrating on individual member states' policies, perhaps seeing certain specific areas in which the EU might help? It would be very interesting to know, with all your insight and experience, which strategic direction you would take if you had a free hand.
This is maybe jumping the script slightly in some ways, but I think what is overwhelmingly demonstrable is that if you think in the longer run, for any society where migrants arrive, full and comprehensive membership has to be part and parcel of the aspiration, for the benefit of all, not the benefit of the migrants alone. And I think in that context there are currently numerous divergences between European Union states about how much the third country nationals and even people moving within the Union itself are allowed access to full and absolute rights of citizenship once they arrive. And I think that this is a personal opinion rather than a strongly, I would say there is an evidence base behind it, but I think where the Union's competencies could be most effectively directed would be actually looking at processes of migration and integration which have worked best over not 2, 3 or 4 years, but 10, 20, 30 years, and actually trying to identify how harmonisation might work at that level, whilst recognising simultaneously my personal starting point is very much the enormous divergences in the needs of different nation states at any one time within the Union.
In that context, would you say that the EU is very good or weak at predicting future pressures that are likely to affect migration? or is the EU constantly trying to manage what has overtaken it? And also, would you agree that the EU is not, or is, as effective as it should be in influencing what goes on in wider circles of the UN and elsewhere about the movement of people? I think, for example, obviously, of the implications of climate change.
I mean, that's getting onto a different area where Hugo, I'm sure, is much better qualified than myself to judge, but I think both nation states and the EU are frequently working through anachronistic frames of reference. And so if you look at, as I say, if you look at the difference between what is happening right now in Scotland and what is happening right now in London, as opposed to parts of, say, the industrial north-west, the divergences within nations are quite profound. So our facility to understand those, I think, is frankly limited in the context of migration. So I would come back to the point of subsidiarity where we began before. If one is trying to create intelligent systems, one needs to think about multi-scalar governance, which actually recognises what is happening below the level of the nation state, at the level of the nation state, and at the level of the European Union. I think I would be hesitant about saying either the EU or nation states in that sense have either a greater or lesser competence in terms of trying to match rapid institutional design with even more rapid processes of social change.
Presumably this what you've identified there as the differences within and between member states is very much the case in something we haven't said very much about so far, which is demographic trends.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which clearly are very different from different countries.
That's absolutely true.
The Mediterranean border of the European Union, and indeed Germany as well, in what you call demographic collapse, decline, anyway, sharp reduction, and then others like France and the UK, whose populations are still expanding quite rapidly.
That's absolutely true.
Just finish one other question, and that is that there is a lot of discussion, debate at the moment, in the context of the global financial crisis, about the need for greater political integration within Europe, if it is to meet the situation which confronts it. Would you agree that any such closer integration is not just a matter of economic policy, it's also a matter of social policy? And that therefore, if there is a serious consideration of closer integration, migration in its implications should be very central to that debate?
I think I would agree with that, yes.
Indeed. I mean, that's a very broad brush approach to the whole migration issue, which is ultimately we'll never get to this global infrastructure or even a proper regional infrastructure. It's helpful to think about what's happening around the world. For example, Australia and New Zealand have just signed a free movement agreement. So these two countries that are very like each other and have always developed side by side and broadly at the same rate are only just getting to free movement now, whereas we've had free movement in the European Union for years and years. The ASEAN countries want to talk about have an official migration dialogue now, and they want to move towards something like what we have here in the European Union. But on the sort of the problems we faced over the last couple of years, as Lord Mackenzie referred to, in terms of the social impact of migration and the big crisis with France and Italy in the Schengen area last year, and then the fears over the Arab Spring and all that, we will never really find a way of discussing migration in a sensible way until we join up three aspects. One is the urge to migrate to an area that boasts the world's highest standard of living. The second is the sort of the urge of governments to control those flows, even though they're not really powerful enough to do so. The nation state has never really been powerful enough to control borders. Borders are an abstract concept. And the third force is the resistance of democratic politics to migration, because what we're talking about is a system of insiders, the voters, who don't like the arrival of outsiders, the migrants. And until we find a way to join up those three different dimensions of the issue, we won't really have what sounds like a coherent policy discussion that we can get serious, concrete initiatives out of. But just to get to be concrete about what that means for the global approach, well, right now, for example, the Danish presidency produced a paper on action plan on migratory pressures. Now, if you read the action plan, it has some very, very good ideas how the various bits of the EU bureaucracy and Frontex, the border agency, and the member states can cooperate better on identifying and responding to migratory pressures. What it doesn't say is what the migratory pressures are. So that's the stage we're at the moment, which is that we're still talking about how to produce ideal processes to manage migration. What we don't seem to be able to do in the global approach is for member states to sit down and have a serious discussion about what their migratory pressures actually are and what any commonalities between those pressures might imply for cooperation between them. Now that sounds like one of the most obvious things in the world, but I fear that we've lost that, or if we ever had it in the EU, possibly as a result of enlargement, because the countries in the East, the newer countries, have completely different experiences of and pressures from migration and asylum. But I think more just because this is an emerging, sometimes toxic, very sensitive, always very sensitive area. What we need to, also to answer this question and the previous one, I think what we're moving towards, what I would do if I had a blank sheet of paper, is probably organise migration discussions in a more regional... Organise migration discussions on a more regional caucus basis, i.e. I don't think the EU at 27 can have a single identity in these matters, I think, but if you focus cooperation on a regional basis, that might be probably a better way to go, and indeed countries do so, both formally and informally. So what we need to do is, and what I think you should ask people in the course of your inquiry is when do you actually discuss the concrete pressures you face from migration and what comes out of those discussions? Because that's all really that we should be doing. It makes me think that the G6, for example, which is a body that really discusses security questions, could develop a new role in really discussing concrete immigration issues, because they don't really seem to be doing much of it at the moment.
Right.
Well, at that point, do you think that illegal entry flows can be significantly reduced by the intensification of controls at the EU's external borders? Or does intensification simply divert flows to less well-controlled ports of entry, as has already happened in the case of the Greek-Turkish border? And what do you think should be done collectively to reduce illegal migration?
There is a substantial body of work on this, and I'd pick up a point that Hugo raised earlier on, which is much of the evidence demonstrates quite how weak nation states are globally and have been historically at controlling flows of people. It's not a straightforward or palatable truth, but for all of the rhetoric and for all of the extraordinary amounts of money spent on enforcement, the conjuncture of desire to move and states' facilities to control movement actually tends to end up very much in the realm of the migrants finding ways, and that's true across the world at the moment. So if you look at the United States, which spends an absolute fortune on enforcement, that is the case. Having said that, I mean the counterfactual to your question is hypothetical, right? I mean it's one would not know what the flows might be for every incremental decrease in expenditure. So in one very obtuse but accurate answer to your question is we don't know the answer. But I think if you look at the amount of work that is done around irregular flows of migration to Europe, but also irregular flows in migration studies in other advanced economic contexts, the evidence is not very strongly in favour of very large amounts of expenditure producing very major consequences in terms of facility to control. I think there are arguments made in the Canadian literature and in the American literature that actually if you start evaluating these policies in terms of expenditure, then one begins to raise some quite serious questions actually about the amounts that are spent. And one of the things that I think we talked about earlier on that maybe we didn't address in great detail about the global approach, but I think in the global approach there is this extraordinary emphasis on Frontex and in issues of enforcement, whereas I think the realities sometimes defy the rhetorics of the states and the policies.
But Frontex had to step in when the Greek border controls broke down, didn't it?
Yes, that's
And Mr. Brady mentions the 223 million euros that were granted to Greece to strengthen their own capacity to deal with migration across the Greek-Turkish frontier, which he says didn't work because they were not recruiting any further civil servants. And when we face the problem of a border state with weak capacity, and that may also apply to Bulgaria and Romania, then presumably money spent by the European Union in trying to improve their capacity to deal with irregular migration is always going to be wasted, because they won't have the ability to apply it.
As I say, I mean, the counterfactual as to what would happen if that money was not spent is not going to be straightforwardly evident, is it?
But of course, I mean, you can question, say, I noticed the other day there was talk of building a wall along somewhere on the Greco-Turkish border, although it's a river. How you build a wall down the middle of a river, I'm not quite sure, but there's probably an answer to that question. But the suggestion then was that that was considered to be a very foolish way of spending a very large amount of money to no great benefit. So, you, again, as with others of the questions we've been pursuing this morning, you can come to the conclusion that some things are quite unwise to do, but that doesn't mean that everything to limit illegal migration is unwise. I wonder if we could turn just now to the question of Schengen. Hugo, you in your CER publication, Saving Schengen, discussed a range of challenges. You took a very pessimistic view, I remember, at the time. A range of challenges to the survival of the free movement area, including the proposals that the French and the Italians put forward following their disagreement in the early stages of the Arab awakening. And then there were the problems at the Greco-Turkish border, with which we've been referring to in several of the questions and answers so far. And then there's the risk of enlargement and the unsolved issue of the admission of Bulgaria and Romania to Schengen. Looking at it now, as opposed to then, do you think the Schengen area will survive in the coming years? What needs to be done to ensure that it does survive? I wonder what you think about those questions.
Well, thank you very much. I'm flattered that you would directly address a report of mine in your questions. But it takes us on directly from the last conversation, which is helpful, because the EU has these instruments. For example, it has various funds for refugee protection, the return of illegal immigrants, integration, and so on. And in line the same way as I said, the mobility partnerships need evaluating. Well, another thing we need to do is evaluate how the money from those funds gets spent. The EU has about 4 billion over in its 7-year budget available in funds to be drawn down for these purposes. It will probably double the amount of money in those funds after, and consolidate them into 2 funds, one for migration issues and one for security issues. But in similar funds in the US, for example, they have a stipulation that if you have a refugee fund, which the various US states draw from, a certain amount of money has to follow the refugee. So if you draw down $6,000 per refugee, then $4,000 has to follow the refugee. It has to be literally put into their hand and spent on their living costs, and only $2,000 may be absorbed in administration and so on. I think we need that sort of scrutiny for what is actually a very fundamental tool, because one of the only things the EU can do in terms of improving border surveillance and immigration frameworks in the individual countries is money. we have these funds, the Commission brings the money, establishes the networks, Member States pull it down, as I mentioned in my report. In the case of Greece, they sometimes have problems doing that because of a lack of qualified staff and a lot of red tape. So that's something the committee needs to focus on in future in that area, because these are one of the primary tools we have to strengthen the Schengen area. And the fate of the Schengen area matters very, very much for Britain, because if there's chaos inside the Schengen area, this will have a direct knock-on effect on Britain's own attempts to control its own borders and reform its immigration system. Now, on the current political events, so what has happened so far is, as you noted, I painted a rather pessimistic picture of the prospects for the Schengen area, but indeed I do not in fact believe that the Schengen area will ever really collapse. It may fracture or shrink back towards its original membership of 5 or 6, but even then I think that the area itself could be rebuilt after some reforms and so on. I don't think that's the case for the Eurozone, for example. I think if the Euro collapses or country drops out of the Euro, then that's a pretty irreversible thing. But I think that the great thing about the Schengen area is that even if we do have political schisms inside Schengen, we can still re-establish passport-free travel in the future. Now, the Danes, quite courageously in my view, opposed a proposal by the Commission to some degree centralise the Schengen system by allowing the Commission wanted the power to say that Member States could only impose border controls under certain circumstances, and they wanted the power to police that. The problem with Schengen is that in such a sensitive area as immigration and border policy, that's a system that was never really meant to be centralised. So the Danes were faced with what would have been a politically unacceptable cessation of sovereignty to the Commission, on the one hand, and also with the need to actually fix a system which doesn't work hugely well. Now, the departure of Nicolas Sarkozy from the scene really helps. Actually, Schengen has been very politically lucky this year, because number one, Sarkozy is no longer president in France, which means that the person who was originally behind this whole issue of rewriting the Schengen rule book, which has proved too controversial for everyone, and made everybody think that actually the original system didn't work too badly, is now gone, and therefore we can think about a more sensible way to reform the Schengen area, and that has to include directly not addressing, very similar to the Eurozone crisis. It doesn't mean addressing the overall way Schengen is structured, but addressing the actual real problems, and the real problem is the border with Greece. If they don't do something to stabilise Greece's immigration situation, which is in a very bad way indeed, then it's not really feasible for me that Greece can remain a member of the Schengen area. And given that the fact that there's no way to kick out a country from the Schengen area, this means that the political problem we have in Schengen is still there. Now, the Romanians have also done the Schengen area a huge favour by having a huge conflict over the rule of law in their country, which now makes their accession to Schengen over the next 6 months less likely than it was before. Now, when I wrote that paper in January, people told me that 2 things I had written in the paper were very unrealistic. Number 1, to say that Romania and Bulgaria shouldn't be let in for 2 years. And number 2, that the EU would arrive at any sort of accord with Turkey on visa liberalisation. Well, today, it's not looking likely at all that at least Romania will join in the short term. And the EU has indeed moved forward talks with Turkey, including on the signing of a readmission agreement for illegal immigrants. So it's amazing in immigration policy how things can change very quickly in a short space of time. So my answer in short is, number 1, I think Schengen's been lucky this year on 3 counts. Number 1, the French situation is better. France is in many ways the Britain of Schengen. It's quite Eurosceptic about the Schengen area. Number 2, Bulgaria, the situation in Bulgaria and Romania has been seen in its real light, and the people can now see the linkage between the rule of law and the maintenance of the external border. I believe ultimately that's a healthy process. Number 3, the Arab Spring has not resulted, as Michael has alluded, in the huge waves, the human tsunami, as Silvio Berlusconi called it, from Tunisia and Libya and other places during the summer. In fact, we haven't really had many reports of mass movements of boat people in the Mediterranean over the last couple of months, unlike previous years. So in that sense, a lot of the political tensions surrounding Schengen are not there in the way we thought they would be. But the fundamental underlying problem, which is that we don't have a way of ensuring member states maintain proper border controls, as they're supposed to do under the Schengen Border Code, we still don't have a proper way for evaluating the external border, and we don't have a way of enforcing improvements to the external border. And that problem will persist throughout the various immigration panics that happen in the medium to long term.
Thank you. Professor Keith, do you want to say anything on this one?
No, I think
no. Right, Lord Lingfield.
Yes, what is your view of immigrant integration in the UK today? And perhaps comment also on integration throughout the EU. And do you think that the debate on integration focuses too much on culture and too little on education and employment?
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe I can start with the second part of your question first, and then come back, because I think the second part of your question I would agree with. I think debate does focus far too much on culture. As a shorthand, I would refer you back to the report I alluded to earlier on, the Commission on Integration and Cohesion, where we actually identified 4 key principles for integration. The first of which was a notion of shared futures that suggested that policy levers should concentrate on acknowledging the diverse routes through which people came to a particular place, and concentrate on developing dialogue across migrant and settled communities about a future of both neighbourhood and larger geographical units. An emphasis on the multi-scalar nature of citizenship rights. So although we think about citizenship in terms of the nation state, in reality the ways in which public goods are rationed works at the level above the nation state and below the nation state. A third principle of notions of belonging and identity, which would build on a slightly more communitarian model of integration, where if you look in the United Kingdom for evidence, all of this, the polling evidence demonstrates that affinity to neighbourhood tends to be much stronger the lower down the geographical scale that you go. So people have very strong identification with their neighbourhood, with their local authority area, with their city, frequently much stronger than with the nation as a whole. Now, it can be seen as slightly simplistic, but the fourth principle that we advanced was a sense of maintaining a sense of equality and aspirations towards equality. Now, I don't think those 4 principles that are at the heart of the report of the Commission on Integration and Cohesion describe everything that is necessary around integration, but what I do think they identify is a need to recognise the appropriate scale at which integration is taken forward. And in your question, you identify issues of education and employment. And as I was saying earlier on, what that in turn implies is thinking about the logics of the educational system, which works most effectively, whether we call them local education authorities or whatever the geographical remit at which we think of networks of schools working together. If you're thinking about employment, we need to think about key sectors, and the Swedish experience has been alluded to already on this. I think that the demands on employers, I think, are addressed in our report, but can be taken forward more seriously. But I think what all of that does suggest is there is much too strong an emphasis on culture in many of the debates that have characterised not only the United Kingdom, but also the Sarkozy-Merkel contributions to the debate on multiculturalism in the last couple of years, or some of the public debates in Denmark and Sweden, where, again, I think a focus on religious faith as much as culture frequently, I think, confuses as much as it contributes to an understanding of integration process on the ground. And I think if you look at the United Kingdom, I mean, although I don't think people should be Panglossian about it, that the record is not too bad over the last 30, 40 years. And I think if you look at parts of London and the scales of change that London has got, the scale of change that London has gone through over the last the post-war era alone, and the ways in which the accommodation of new populations has worked itself through over that period of time, the UK's record is not too bad in an international context. And I think part and parcel of that is because of the ways in which the city works as a place to live, and there are downsides to the fact that you have a very dynamic economy and a sense of change. So the population churn in some parts of inner London is as high as 25-30%. But it means the process of living with strangers and living with people of different backgrounds becomes normalised in some ways. And I think we undervalued that as our peril. And I think if we focus on integration as a more objective sense of the ways in which societies and places adapt to new flows of people, rather than become particularly concerned with cultural predispositions, then I think it would actually be altogether much better. The only caveat I would have, and I'm not quite sure whether it fits in your box of culture or not, is the issue of language. And I think all of the evidence demonstrates the importance of language learning in terms of a facility to contribute to society more generally, and all policy that can advance that is, I think, important across the board. And I think if you look in the European case, and I think the most egregious in some ways would be the Netherlands at the moment, the more integration policies tend to focus on the cultural, I think the less successful they are in certain ways.
That's very helpful. Very interesting, yes. I mean, I get the impression from some of your answers that you're saying that rather than Britain sort of just separating itself off and seeing itself as different from other European countries, we might actually have quite a bit to teach them in some of our experiences in this field, and that talking a little bit more positively about what individual European countries can learn from each other might be better than making speeches about multiculturalism.
I think that is true. I would also think that the level at which the learning takes place is frequently the level of the metropolis or metropolitan government as much as the nation state. So within the Netherlands, within France, within the United Kingdom, the learning is frequently below the level of national departments.
Well, that was something we came across very much in the course of our previous study on drugs, where we noticed that cooperation between cities and regions in different parts of the European Union was every bit as much as important as cooperation between governments.
I would strongly support that, yeah.
Yeah. Right, Baroness Prussia. Sorry, did you want to... Yes.
Whilst language obviously is important in enabling new migrants to find their way in our society, do you think it trumps the principle of family reunification? I mean, in European policy, should we be denying entry to dependents of principal migrants because they can't speak enough of the language, or should we alternatively encourage them to learn the host language once they've arrived here?
I think in the abstract, I think it's a false dichotomy. In the reality, though, I know that there are situations right now in which that dichotomy is being put forward, and my personal opinion is that human rights triumph over the utilitarian needs in that sense.
Baroness Prussia.
Can I begin by saying how much I agree with your answer on integration, but could I just ask a supplementary before I ask my other question? Your report on integration and cohesion, you made the recommendations. Despite that, why do you think there is so much emphasis now on multi-faith work? Why do you think they've gone in that direction?
I think some parts of this are to do with the geopolitics of security and the fears that have followed on from the events of 9/11 and 7th of July 2005, and I think we can't pretend those away. I'm not sure how relevant this is to the committee's deliberations, but I think one can either be in favour of or antagonistic to British foreign policy, but it doesn't matter where one stands on that spectrum, but to deny a connection between what happens across the world and what is happening in the cities of Britain, I think would be naive. So I think there is a reality to some of the transnational links that tie religious sentiment to or cross national boundaries through religious sentiment, and we can't pretend those away either. So in the part of London I know best, which is in East London, the events that happen in Bangladesh today and what happens to Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League plays out on the streets of East London. That's part of the reality that we live by. Now, I think that is one strand which has kind of pushed the interfaith position. I think there is a second dynamic which is also has several different sources, which is that as the faith in the post-war welfare state has in some ways diminished, or a faith that has come from, if you like, a move away from the Swedish model of the welfare state in the United Kingdom, crudely put, then whether we talk about the debate around the big society or other communitarian initiatives, then there is a sense in which people look to make sense of civil society, and when they look to make sense of civil society, faith organisations are important in any objective understanding. Now, it is quite a big logical leap from an observation that faith organisations are important in the structuring of civil society to a policy prescription that says that there should be a lot of work around interfaith. But that's probably a subject for a different discussion.
We can debate elsewhere.
Yeah.
But can I ask the question, which is really about UK, and I mean, how do you think you can contribute constructively and effectively to EU's migration policy when it has opted out of many of the legislative measures underpinning the policy?
Well, in a way, I think we've identified two areas already today. One is in the field of integration, where I think that the issue of learning is as important as the issue of harmonisation. And I think that there is, I don't want to repeat things we've talked about already, but I think that would be one very productive area. The second is around some of the work that has progressed partly through the Migration Advisory Committee. But when we're thinking about identifying labour market, if we go back to where I began at the beginning, if you go back to those very basic elements of migration, of numbers, selection and rights, if one tries to rationalise and make objective our deliberative process around those, there are a number of areas of policy making, not least around, for example, labour market tests and identifying labour market needs, where I think there is evidence from the United Kingdom that can be again shared and are potentially, if one goes back to the four pillars of that we began with the global approach, there are ways in which, as I said, harmonisation does not necessarily mean harmonisation of all instruments. I think that there are areas of harmonisation around labour market testing, for example, that could be productive.
And do you think the UK should at some stage become a full member of the Schengen area?
I think I'd be agnostic myself.
Sorry?
I think I would be agnostic myself. In some way.
Why are you agnostic?
Partly because of the very lucid description of the challenges that Hugo laid out, which identify more optimistic and less optimistic scenarios for the way forward. So my personal predisposition is more pro-European on those things, but with a sense of constructive critique about what one is joining at any stage, I think. I don't know, Hugo's probably better position to answer for that.
Both parts of Rashal's question, perhaps you could, whether Britain weakens its position very greatly by being half in and half out, as it were, in the JHA area, and migration in particular, and also the question about Schengen.
Well, it's a fascinating time to be discussing this issue, not least because the UK is considering leaving a big block of the Justice and Home Affairs acquis anyway, and because one of your previous witnesses, Charles Clarke, when he was Home Secretary, set interesting test for how Britain could join the Schengen area. Now, there's no doubt about it that joining the Schengen area for Britain would be possibly as difficult as joining the Eurozone in some ways, because, I mean, except that it wouldn't require a referendum. But it
would. Under the legislation that was passed.
Oh, under the EU Act now it would, of course, yeah.
It most certainly would require a referendum.
But I mean, in such a circumstance, I could never see the British public voting for to abolish frontier controls with the rest of the European Union, given how sensitive and politicised an issue immigration has been for the last couple of years. So, and we must remember that Britain does participate in elements of Schengen already, the policing and information exchange elements of Schengen. But the issue over, there's no doubt about it that British cherry picking does at times infuriate its EU partners and reduce its influence around the table. I'm thinking specifically about British attempts to join Frontex and get access to the Schengen so-called Article 96 data, which is about refusals at the common EU border, as well as to access the visa information system, which is a new system for centrally storing and querying all visas issued for the Schengen area. In fact, the VIS will become one of the largest biometric databases in the world, and Britain's security services would very much love to get access to it. But other Schengen members have said no, on the principle that if you don't share the burden of common borders, you don't get the cherry of shared cooperation and the extra information. However, I do see a need for some sort of new cooperation arrangement between the common travel area, incorporating Britain and Ireland, and the Schengen area. Across a range of things. For example, the CER published a fine paper, not by myself but by someone called Michael Emerson, on the additional costs in terms of tourism that the CTA plus Schengen attract almost the majority of world tourism, which is an incredible statistic. But if you're visiting from China, and the rising Chinese middle class is expected to be the next big thing in tourism, you're not going to get a visa for both areas. You're just going to sort of get a visa. Getting a visa is stressful enough for anyone, so it's more likely that you will boost tourism if the two areas had some sort of visa connection or an agreement to recognise each other's visas in certain circumstances. Also on issues like security, and I'd be very interested to see what type of cooperation is happening with the Olympics and so on, for example. There are a number of areas in which I think this coalition government, rather than talking about opting out of vast swathes of EU legislation, which is not a lot of it not particularly relevant, they could be talking about a greater, closer relationship on issues of shared interest with the Schengen area, and that might help improve the politics on things like working with Frontex, getting access to VIS, getting access to other data from the Schengen area.
And do you think this cooperation will happen regardless of Britain being a full member of the Schengen?
To a certain, well, this is a very interesting question right now, because Britain is considering taking a further step backwards from the whole Justice and Home Affairs area, and I'm currently researching whether or not this would, in fact, what impact this would have, if any, on Britain's influence around the table. If you speak to British officials, it's very much the view that Britain is a large and important country, has a very mature and well-respected law enforcement and security establishment, which has very deep links with their continental counterparts and so on, and a long history of cooperation. It would be very unlikely to throw all that out the window just over some obscure protocol in the EU's treaties. Furthermore, Britain, as we have discussed, doesn't opt into any EU legal migration measure. But this doesn't really reduce its influence around the table, because Britain does have very clear ideas about what European cooperation should be achieving. For example, at the moment, the two big messages I suspect you're hearing from the government is that they want a global approach to focus more on illegal immigration, because there is a sense that the common external border, no matter what the debate is about the efficiency of spending a lot of money building walls and other silly gestures like that, this is a political matter, and the politics of the immigration issue will not be improved until we can show greater cooperation between various EU countries on illegal immigration. So, the second thing the British want is that the global approach focuses more on specific countries of interest, and preferably specific countries of interest to it. So in this, the British are around the table and they're influential because of their size, yes, but also because they have things to say. For example, if Sweden were not in all of these legal migration directives, it would still be quite influential because the Swedes have a lot of clear ideas on immigration. Other countries, sit there and say nothing. So I do think that Britain still has the ability to wield great influence in this area, and it wields influence to a remarkable degree. Partially because, yes, the British are very clever and do all their homework beforehand, but also because, interestingly, France is quite sceptical on EU free movement, so it's not at the forefront of policy formation in the area. And Germany has a divided internal security structure internally. Because of its post-war constitution, any EU initiative is the subject of a long series of consultations between its 16 different states. So Britain gets to fill this vacuum, partially because it has a well-developed and mature security services. The police are largely autonomous of government. And the question I'm considering now is how much damage, if any, leaving a large part of EU agreements in this area would actually do to Britain's influence. And I must say I've already concluded that it will do some. So.
Well, that's fascinating, and I hope that your research will see the light of day in time to be something which we can consider when we conduct our next inquiry, which is about Protocol 26, and which we will be starting towards the end of the year. So, and of course, if you felt able to share your research at whatever stage you've got to when the call for evidence for that inquiry goes out, that will be very welcome. If you wish to give us evidence, that will equally be very welcome. And we've just started on a subject which we're all going to hear a lot more about. So could I thank both of you for coming along this morning and giving us a great deal of food for thought. It has been genuinely useful to us to hear those views, and so thank you very much.
Thanks for the invitation.
Committee Room 3, Sound.